Testing, testing. Good morning. My name is John Herbst. I am the director of the Dino Patrizio Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for coming to this conference on the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We have read a lot in the past 6 or 8 months about the immigration crisis in Europe and how that is a threat to European institutions and how it requires a prompt resolution. And of course, the immigration crisis they refer to is the crisis coming from the south, from a completely unstable, partly destabilized by Western action Middle East. It's interesting. Of course, the figures that they talk about in connection with that crisis, 1 to 2 million, are serious. But in Europe itself, as a result of a nuclear superpower using its army to seize territory by force, you have a crisis of over 2 million displaced people. According to the UN, 1.7 of those are internally displaced in Ukraine. 500,000 or a bit more may be refugees in Russia. But it's interesting that this is not considered a global crisis. It's not considered an existential problem for Europe because, and this is something which is interesting and important and never remarked upon, the people who have fled from the fighting caused by Kremlin aggression in Ukraine's east have decided to stay in Ukraine. So in a sense, you might say, something right is happening in Ukraine despite the war, despite the problems of corruption. And yet, Europe pays insufficient attention to the crisis caused by Kremlin aggression and to the support Ukraine needs to deal with that aggression. And so today we're going to talk about the humanitarian crisis, which is very real and very problematic in a country with a relatively low standard of living, relatively low per capita income, facing a war of aggression from the world's second largest military. And with that, we have an excellent panel that will talk to you. First in this session, we have a second excellent panel this afternoon. I'd like to thank System Capital Management for making this event possible. I'd like to encourage everyone to go to #ACUkraine for this event. And with that, I'll get out of the way and let the real experts talk. Thank you. And Alexei Chapitska will be the moderator of the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for your warm and informative welcome. And thank you to you and to the Atlantic Council for convening this very timely and important discussion today. We are lucky to have with us a group of top experts: Hrihori Nemiria, Member of Parliament and Chair of the Human Rights Committee; Adrian Karednitsky, a Senior Non-Resident Fellow from the Atlantic Council; Taras Berezovets, Director of Burda Communications in Kiev; and Governor Ihor Rainin, the Governor of Kharkiv Oblast, who is joining us live from Kharkiv. We would like to start today's session by turning the floor over to each of our panelists to give some opening remarks, followed by some moderated discussion, and finally concluding with some Q&A with you in the audience. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Mr. Nemiria.
Thank you, Alexa, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and all those who are trying their best not to lose focus on the situation in Ukraine as such, but especially on the situation in eastern Ukraine, which is still suffering from the aggression of the Russian Federation, which, as a country, Ukraine still coping with the uncertainties created by the illegal annexation by the Russian Federation of Crimea. And all these are happening in the context of further decline in living standards that are only partially a result of the war in the East, but significantly also as part of either poor governance, lack of reform, or at least lack of policy coherence in implemented very much needed reform for Ukraine to be a success story. So I would like to put my remarks in this context, but at least first to give you an idea of the scale of the crisis. The topic of the event is humanitarian crisis. So, and just not to be biased in a way presenting, and this is the first problem I want to highlight, this is a lack of verifiable, consistent flow of statistics about the situation in various dimensions. I would rely as a source, as a reliable source, to the most recent estimate provided by the International Organization of Migration. According to the IOM, there are 3.7 affected population, 3.1 million persons in need of humanitarian assistance, 2.7 million affected people living in non-government controlled areas, NGCA, the abbreviation, including 600,000 living along the contact line. So that gives you an estimate, a picture of the scale of the crisis. If you would like to compare, and I would like to single out the IDPs, the internally displaced persons, to compare this scale of this situation with a bit different, but still in the essence the same challenge that a country, much more prosperous country within the European Union are dealing with. Officially registered numbers of the internally displaced persons in Ukraine, according to the Ministry of Social Policy and Labor, 1.8 million. For the country of 43 million people. If you compare this with a bit more than 1 million refugees that arrived to Germany last year, 2015, a country with a population twice as much as Ukraine, you could immediately sense a difference in the scale, especially take into account that Germany is a much more stronger and healthier in almost every sense, from the economic prosperity to the overall stability of the institutions that are dealing with the issues, including the justice system, including law enforcement agencies. This is the first thing, to recognize, to admit, to move beyond the state of denial, to recognize the scale of the problem. Then we have to make an effort also to put this in a bit a more sophisticated perspective. What we are talking about, of course, it's very natural, logical, to talk about humanitarian crisis. And of course, there is a need to talk about the various dimensions of the humanitarian crisis, starting from the very obvious needs in clean water, housing, access to public health, to education, jobs, social benefits, and all that influences daily life of almost 2 million people, if we're talking of IDPs, just IDPs. It is necessary. Of course, it is necessary to talk about the clear lack of the access to justice in the gray zone, so-called gray zone, along the touch line or contact line, which is almost 500 kilometers. The phenomena that, for example, only in Donetsk Oblast, in the so-called gray zone, where neither Ukrainian government nor self-proclaimed authorities in Donetsk have an access to, a stable access to. We have almost 9,000 children going to the schools. And just 2 days before I arrived to Washington, D.C., one of the schools in the small town of Krasnogorovka, 12 kilometers from Donetsk, has been ruined because of yet more shelling, indiscriminate shelling that arrived from the territories that the government does not control. And there is no reliable reports whether children or teachers were impacted or not. Of course, this is all that needs to be addressed. And of course, it is legitimate to pose sometimes difficult questions. Do we have, on the ground, consistent policy which results of the well thought through national strategy to dealing with such humanitarian crisis? Do we have institutions, in case we have such policy, that are well equipped to implement it and to be accountable, responsive to a very difficult situation which is changing significantly every month? And here I would like to draw the attention, because the thrust, the organizing idea of the event, to try to look a bit beyond the narrowly defined humanitarian crisis. Again, my intention not to decrease the importance of dealing and respond effectively to the humanitarian crisis and all the range of the needs that it's produced, but a bit provoke strategic approach dealing with the phenomena which is not going to dissipate sometime soon. Because by definition, humanitarian crisis is something like emergency. It's a humanitarian emergency. And as such, it's by default is short-term, which requires quick, consistent, effective deliverables of the goods, services, shelters, everything that is response to the immediate emergencies. But the more you think of the root causes of the conflict, the more you become acquainted with the details of the everyday life on the both sides of the contact lines, including the immediate proximity to the conflict zone. And there are 5 regions in Ukraine, including Kharkiv Oblast, but also Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and 2 most significantly, Donetsk and Lugansk, where almost 75% of those IDPs are currently residing. This is the thing we have to appreciate. But at the same time, my intention to call and to invite those present and those who hopefully will take responsible decisions in terms of the policies to consider humanitarian crisis as an opportunity and to invest in bridging the gap between the humanitarian crisis paradigm and development approach paradigm. So I think the more we think of the crisis, and if you believe in the methodology of the UN Commissioner on Refugees, the UNHCR defines protracted displacement as a phenomena when at least 25,000 internally displaced persons in a given country continue to have the same status in the course of more than 5 years. At least 25,000 in the course of more than 5 years. We're talking now of almost 2 million people in the course of more than 2 years almost. And nobody, if you would give a poll here, who among those who are present believe that the conflict is going to be resolved sometime soon and all those 2 million will come back to the place of their permanent residence? Not very many. I would not even try. Then we have to recognize that we are dealing with the phenomena of protracted displacement, of protracted situation which calls for at least mid-term time horizon, if not long-term time horizon. And the mid-term and long-term could be only efficient when you employ this development paradigm. Because what is development paradigm as a difference or in addition to the humanitarian crisis paradigm? When you consider the same IDPs, as we're concentrating on this for the time being, as an opportunity, those people who are bringing to the host community some new skills, some new experience, some new mobility, some new opportunities. This is something that's really healthy, but calls for necessary strategy that doesn't exist so far, and the policies, and then institutions to implement. So this is the first call I want to make. So let's, while recognizing and trying to organize as much as possible, in addition to those efforts that we could discuss this later, that the Ukrainian government, and not just government, but also private sector players, volunteers are doing in Ukraine. But think more about mid to longer term. The second, and I will conclude with this for these introductory remarks, has to do with the perception of those people who left the area, Donbass. My hometown is Donetsk, as well as my wife, my parents, who left not because they wanted to. They loved their area, small Batkivshchina, Malaya Rodina. But because of the security, because their life was in the threat. And because we currently have, among the IDPs, almost 13% of children. We have 5% people with disabilities. We have a number of other vulnerable groups that needs a specific approach to. But then there are two schools of thoughts, and I will be very frank with you because I'm here talking to friends here. There are two schools of thoughts in Ukraine as far as the, let's narrow this, IDPs are concerned, internally displaced persons, or вимушені переселенці, as they are called in Ukraine. The one school of thought consider the IDPs as a part of the problem, and as a consequences, as a burden, in all senses, in all dimensions. A burden for the budget, a burden to the politicians to whom those IDPs used not to vote for, and there is a political calculations we're talking to as far as the political and electoral rights of the IDPs are concerned, not just social rights. So this is school of thought. Why I'm using this language, school of thought? Because there is no official policy as such. There is no national strategy in Ukraine as far as IDPs are concerned. We have to recognize this. Yes, there are policies, but those policies, the more you talk about these policies, they look like improvisations. Like a fire brigade to go there and there to stop this or that fire. The alternative school of thought considers the IDPs as a part of the solution, not as a part of the problem. And again, in this sense, IDPs are not a burden, but an opportunity to utilize. Let's take the idea of reintegrating, really reintegrating Donbass, because it is a Ukrainian Donbass, and it's impermissible to use it as a bargaining chip for some grand design with the neighboring Russia. If we want to reintegrate Donbass, and Donbass is Ukrainian, then the 1.8 million IDPs is a crucial factor to succeed in within this strategy. If you want not to use loyalties of those IDPs who, as John rightfully mentioned, didn't leave Ukraine to go to Russia or to the third country. They stayed in Ukraine, where their home is, in their motherland. So then it calls for a really much better, much more accountable, more coherent policy, which is not the case. To sum up, humanitarian crisis is not just an immediate existential humanitarian challenge. It should be considered as a part of a longer-term strategic approach, to consider it as an opportunity for development. And then, as far as the IDPs are concerned, the internally displaced persons are not part of the problem. They should be part of the solution and considered in all levels, including the regional level, including local level, not just national level, as an opportunity to utilize.
Thank you, Hrihoi, for your important points, including focusing on the development paradigm and opportunity, as opposed to simply focusing on the short-term response. Adrian Karatnitsky.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by broadening the issue. I think that a lot of commentators have focused on the idea of how the Russian aggression and the Russian absorption of Crimea and the Russian occupation of the Donbass have created greater unity within the Ukrainian people and have helped in nation building. But I think that the displaced population of Ukraine is also an incredibly important opportunity for deepening the patriotic connection of that part of the population, of including it in the discourse of a democratic, European-oriented Ukraine. And for that strategy to work, the government and the private sector has to find means of communicating. I'm struck by the idea that there is not a single usable platform where these communities can connect with one another at the local level. Many of these refugees or internally displaced are in a sense atomized when they move to other places. Many register for social services and half of them are pensioners, but the other half are not. And I think that the idea of, most of them are not registering purely for the provision of social services. There is a population there which is becoming integrated into their communities. Some of these people have transportable skills. These are an important cohort which, if it goes back to the Donbass post-settlement, will be an incredible source of energy for the rebuilding of the Donbass and has to be so nurtured. If they do not go back, they also become important factors in the broadening of Ukraine's region's understanding of other regions. In other words, the direct contact, and I think Taras will speak about some of the polling data, but there was an earlier, more recent polling data about the Donbass, and so on, so I don't want to preempt him, but there was a UN study concluded or released in early June, which showed that only 2% of Ukrainians in cities with large populations of IDPs have negative views of these populations. That means that the Ukrainian population is showing a great deal of political solidarity, and also that these populations are behaving adequately. Yes, if you probe down the line, there's some unhappiness with some spikes in crime. Some of it may or may not be attributed by local populations to these newer arrivals as part of the overall trends. But in general, the attitudes of Ukrainians are extremely healthy towards the integration. They're extremely strong. The only place where there's a little bit of more dissonance to these populations is in Western Ukraine, where there is, I think, a kind of a cultural unacceptance of them as a less than fully Ukrainian component of the state. But generally, the Ukrainian public passes in flying colors. Not so the elites. And here, I think, is another challenge for the elite. It is extremely important, to understand that many of the people who remain still under Russian-occupied LNR and DNR, remain under this terrorist occupation, are people who feared not having transportable skills, people who have elderly whom they cannot leave, people who have family ties, school teachers who don't want to leave because students are still there and they feel an obligation. And I think that what the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian authorities have to find ways of being vigorous defenders of their humanitarian interests. There was a study done by a Berkeley professor published in Vox Ukraine about a month or two ago that showed amazing spiking of food prices in the LNR and DNR, which suggests that there are food security issues, logistical issues, et cetera, et cetera. The propaganda pictures of Russia rolling in relief supplies covers up the fact that there is also a humanitarian catastrophe going on for the people who have remained behind, some of whom are not disloyal to the Ukrainian state, some of whom may be zombified by propaganda. But it is extremely important for the Ukrainian leaders and for the Ukrainian state to be a voice for them, to focus on their suffering, and also to use means of legal challenges. I personally, and many of us, favor the idea of the Ukrainian government officially saying that this is a occupation, and that Russia is the foreign occupying power, and that Russia bears under the Geneva Conventions full responsibility for these populations. There are all sorts of mechanisms in which the Ukrainian state and the people who craft the policies of the state should look at this in a very comprehensive way, in a way that builds unity, that shows that the state is really a voice for all of these disenfranchised people who have basically been attacked and bullied by armed invaders and proxy armies. All of this has to be done comprehensively also with a policy of having a dialogue with the IDPs who are now settling either permanently or temporarily in Ukrainian territory. There are some success stories, not perfect, but the efforts to resurrect Donetsk University and other universities in exile, these are areas that are extremely important to preserve and build a new generation of leaders who may come back if the political circumstances change to help rebuild the Donbass. So I would argue that the way that the Ukrainian government and Western aid agencies should approach this complex of matters is really an opportunity to create among the citizens of the Donbass a sense that they are a part of a broad Ukrainian community that within its very limited resources cares for them. There should be a broader campaign of pressuring the international community to come up with larger scales of aid and assistance. I know when there was some hope that the Minsk process was going to yield some kind of a relaxation or possibly lead to a settlement, there were endless numbers of talks of extremely ambitious conferences to provide an aid and assistance package, and we realized that all of those fell to the wayside, and then the European refugee crisis came. We also have to understand that Putin and Russia, just as the Europeans feared that Putin's intervention in Syria was partly a way to potentially influence refugee flows, and about 9 months ago, Europe was awash in panic that Putin was going to manufacture a refugee crisis for Europe. It's important to understand that he has already manufactured that humanitarian crisis, destroying families, destroying millions of lives, destroying huge billions of dollars of infrastructure. But he has not, and I hope that Taras's more recent findings bear up the claim of the earlier studies. He has not destroyed the sense of solidarity among the Ukrainian people. And that means that there is a great potential now to integrate this population that were, in a sense, outliers from the sort of development of a patriotic Ukrainian national discourse and identity, and who were used in manipulations by politics of cultural division, and sometimes were not even, and sometimes it was the other side, meaning the Ukrainian nationalist side, which created discourse that was not building a sense of participation and unification. So I'm not pitting blame only on one side or the other, but the discourse in Ukrainian politics was historically this cultural, pressing a cultural divide and playing cultural politics. This crisis And the attitude of the Ukrainian people shows that it is possible to overcome that long legacy of a cultural divide and to help this population integrate into Ukrainian-controlled territory, and also to be prepared to return with a new public spirit. So I think we need to understand the whole day's work and the whole day's discussion. This is a process of helping people, but it's also of helping Ukraine become whole and to rebuild itself from the Russian-imposed wounds.
An uplifting commentary. Thank you, Adrian. Taras Berezovets.
Thank you very much, Alexa. My name is Taras Berezovets, and I'm originally from Crimea, city of Kerch, the city which is located the closest to the Russian Federation and which should become a place of building, excuse me, of infamous so-called Kerch Bridge. I believe we will talk about this later. What my colleagues just said in here, I think it was absolutely important and absolutely crucial, because the crisis in Ukraine and all these humanitarian problems, they created absolutely new possibilities for creation of Ukrainian nation. A lot of experts back to Ukraine, they believe that Ukraine really became independent not in 1991, but the year 2014. And this is exactly, for 2 years, we have real war for independence with Russian Federation. We have a lot of examples of very successful stories, like my friend and co-founder of our new think tank, Ukrainian Institute for the Future, Igor Lisky, for instance, who is in here and who is from Lugansk Oblast, and who is a very successful, very good businessman, who actually gives a very good example how people who moved from Donbass, from eastern parts of Ukraine, that they really can make a difference. Coming back to Ukraine, the most popular joke at the time of annexation of Crimea, and I actually was a witness of it in February 2014, it was said like this: do you see right sector henchmen here in Crimea? No, I don't, but they are here. But do you see Russian little green men in here? Yes, I do, but they're not here. And it was very, very typical for understanding how Russian propaganda worked. And as a man who grew up in absolutely Russian-speaking neighborhood in Crimea, I can absolutely assure that myths of Russian propaganda, especially about Crimean Tatars, especially about Crimeans, are long-living. And moreover, Russian Federation spent just hundreds of millions, if not billions of US dollars, not only on the territory of Ukraine, but also on overseas. Currently, according to our estimated figure, the annual budget of Russian propaganda overseas is 1.5 billion US dollars, which includes funding of such as TV stations, for instance, as Russia Today, Россия сегодня, with a budget 220 million US dollars, which was made by a special decree by President Putin in year 2014. And RIA Novosti, notorious Russian news agency run by infamous Russian journalist Dmitry Kiselyov, with annual budget 120 million US dollars. And of course, propaganda and its effects we can see not only in Ukraine, but as well here, which is more important here in the United States. Yesterday, we had a talk with Nadia O'Connell, and we talked about the roots of Russian propaganda here in the United States. And my general understanding was that it's not only based on all the myths, but it's also dealing with very emotional things which people can understand very easily. Coming back to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, we should also mention that it not only caused the influx of IDPs within Ukraine from eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. For instance, we should also mention that within this influx is 1.8 million Ukrainians who were forced to move from their homelands. We should also think about and remember 50,000 people who moved from Crimea, both Ukrainians, Russian, Crimean Tatars. And I can assure you that majority of these people are very dedicated to success of Ukrainian state, very much dedicated to the idea of the occupation of Crimea. A lot of them became not only successful businessmen, they're very good as public activists, as journalists, as experts, as artists whatsoever. And moreover, then the first wave of these IDPs from Crimea, for instance, it was mostly for political reasons, for dissidents, for religious reasons. Nowadays, we have people who move to the mainland Ukraine mostly for economic reasons. It's basically businessmen. Just one figure. In year 2013, in Crimea, we had 125 registered businessmen. But nowadays, this general figure is 5 times less. It's only 24,000. So what happened to another 100? Just they were forced to close down their business. And of course, I believe that mainly, primary to Ukrainian fatigue, we have clear understanding that Ukraine's strategy should not be weak in any way. And we are not in a position that we're asking for help. It's rather reason to talk about opportunities, and especially the threats which can be caused by continuation of this undeclared war of Russian propaganda against our country. Because in this report, which I just brought in here, I have just several copies of it. It's dedicated to the 2 years of beginning of ATO on Donbass. And in Crimea as well, we analyzed, and it's in English as well, we analyzed the roots of this war, we analyzed the consequences of it. Just a couple of figures which we also have to mention. According to the data announced, which was announced by President of Ukraine Petro Poroshenko on 28th of March this year, more than 9,000 of Ukrainians, 6.5 thousand of whom were civilians, were killed by occupation forces supported by Russian Federation. And according to the official statistics of SBU, Ukrainian Security Service, as of the end of April, just this very year, 681 Ukrainians were on the list of missing persons, and 268 of them were military personnel, and 413 were still civilians. And 115 Ukrainians are still kept as hostages, 12 of them on the territory of temporarily occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea. The poll, which was conducted by Ukrainian Institute of the Future, and which my friend Adrian Korotnitsky just mentioned to you, and which I will be happy to just announce for the first time because it was not even published back in Ukraine. So we have very interesting figures. This is general Ukrainian poll, especially regarding how people, what do we think about reconciliation with Donbass and Crimea, and what especially do you think about reconciliation with Russian Federation. So the question was asked how Ukraine should resolve the problems of temporarily occupied territories of Donbass. And the most popular answer was actually to have a referendum about recognition of so-called DNR and NLR occupied territories, and to stop any social assistance to these territories. So this 25.9% of Ukrainians said so. The second option was Ukraine should give full autonomy to so-called DNR and LNR, according to the Minsk agreements, and so said 18.3% of Ukrainians. And people also said Ukraine should use law enforcement ways and even military ways to return territories of Donbass, and 21.1% of Ukrainians said so. And the fourth option was not to change anything, just keep it status quo. It's 15.5% of Ukrainians said so.
Ross, if you could wrap up your comments and we can delve into this.
Yeah, sure. Just one final question. It's very important about Donbass. Ukrainians were asked, did your attitude towards Donbass change during 4 years of conflict and war in Ukraine? 39.6% of Ukrainians said no, it didn't, and 39.8% said it worsened. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Taras, very much. Governor Ihorainen.
Very grateful to you for this opportunity to have this very professional discussion on the situation in Ukraine.
хочу сказать, что, наверное, ближе всех Харьковская область находится в зоне террористической операции, в той проблеме, которая сегодня обсуждается.
I must say that Kharkiv region is the closest region to the anti-terrorist operation areas and to the problems which are being discussed now.
Само место, где есть возможность у нас общаться сегодня, 25 миль до границы с Российской Федерацией, 100 миль до зоны антитеррористической операции.
From the place where I'm sitting now, there are only 25 miles to Russian border and 100 miles to the border with the anti-terrorist operation area.
И понятно, что в планах террористов Харьковская область имела особые планы. Именно Харьковская область должна была быть столицей так называемой Новороссии.
And it is quite obvious that terrorists had special plans for Kharkiv region, which was supposed to be the capital of the so-called Novorossiya.
И абсолютно для Путина стало удивлением то, что харьковчане так себя повели и харьковцы.
And it was an absolute surprise for Putin that the citizens of Kharkiv behaved in this way and that Kharkiv survived.
Я хочу напомнить, что весной 2014 года все одновременно начиналось в трех городах: Донецке, Луганске и Харькове.
I would like to remind you that in spring 2014, everything started simultaneously in three cities, in Donetsk, Lugansk, and Kharkiv.
Сценарий действий был синхронизирован до минут.
The scenario was really synchronized up to single minutes.
И сегодня Харьков — это Украина, и здесь уже нет никаких сомнений.
But today Kharkiv is Ukraine, and there are no doubts about that.
Я очень коротко хотел бы остановиться на основных аспектах, как мы видим дальнейшее развитие ситуации, как строим работу в Харьковской области.
Shortly, I would like to outline the perspectives and how we carry out the work in Kharkiv region.
Первое — это обеспечение безопасности региона.
First and foremost, that's security issues and provision of security.
Второе — это обеспечение общественно-политической стабильности.
Secondly, that's social and political stability.
И третье, учитывая ту ситуацию, которая есть сегодня в экономике, это вопросы социальной политики, вопросы гуманитарной политики и вопросы непосредственно региональной экономики.
And thirdly, taking into account the current situation, we consider the social issues and the regional development.
Первый блок — безопасность.
The first block, which is security.
На сегодня Харьков абсолютно мирный, спокойный город.
As for today, Kharkiv is an absolutely peaceful and quiet and calm city.
В область возвращены все массовые мероприятия, как спортивные, так и культурные.
In the region, we organize all kind of mass events, both cultural and sporting events.
Но это абсолютно не значит, что отсутствуют попытки дестабилизации ситуации в регионе.
This does not mean, however, that there are no attempts to destabilize the situation in the region.
Сценарий просто немножко другой.
It's just that the scenario changed.
Подрыв пытаются произвести внутри региона, исходя из тех сил, которые имеются внутри.
Now they're trying to act from inside the region, using the forces which are inside the region.
Я могу сказать, что только в 2016 году, то есть практически за полгода, мы предотвратили около 20 диверсионных атак.
I can tell you that only this year, the year 2016, which is actually only half a year past, we prevented about 20 attacks.
И несколько групп, которые были задержаны, они проходили обучение в российских военных лагерях. Это Белгород, Ростов.
And several groups which were arrested, they had special training in Russian camps in Belgorod and Rostov.
Поэтому ситуация в области стабильная, но напряженная.
So the situation is stable, but it's not simple.
И от нас это требует обеспечения второго блока, о котором я говорил, это стабильность общественно-политической ситуации.
This requires us to provide for the stability of the public and political bloc, the second one, which I was talking about.
Пусть Путин рассчитывал, что он сможет опереться внутри Харькова на определенные политические группы.
Putin thought that he would be able to base upon certain political groups in the city of Kharkiv.
Этого не произошло.
But this did not happen.
Я могу сказать, что сегодня в областном совете 120 депутатов из 6 разных фракций.
I can tell you that in the regional council we have 120 councillors of different political groups.
Это левые движения, правые движения, центристские движения.
They include both left, right, and central groups.
Ну, все основополагающие необходимые документы принимаются 3/4 голосов.
But most of the necessary documents are adopted by the 3/4 of vote.
А многие вопросы, такие важные, как бюджет, экономическое развитие, общественная безопасность, голосуются с результатом 0 против.
And many really important issues such as budget, economical development, and security are voted with 0% being against this decision.
Это говорит о том, что политические силы, независимо от своих идеологической линии, объединились вокруг безопасности территории.
This means that
Sorry for interrupting, Governor. Your comments are very, very interesting. Could you kindly focus the last 2 minutes of your comments on the humanitarian crisis there in Kharkiv, and then we look forward to delving into this later in the discussion. Thank you.
Для того, чтобы победить гуманитарный кризис, нужны серьезные успехи в региональной экономике.
to overcome the humanitarian crisis, we need huge successes in regional economy.
Я могу сказать, что по экспортной оценке правительства Украины с 62 показателей Харьковская прифронтовая область занимает первое место.
I can tell you that according to the government expertise, which was done according to 62 indices, Kharkiv region, which is located at the border, occupies the first position.
Это помогло принять 300 тысяч переселенцев в Донецкой и Луганской области.
This helped us to accept 300,000 refugees from the Donetsk and Lugansk region.
Каждый 10-й житель сегодня Харьковской области – это переселенец.
Every 10th citizen of Kharkiv region is an IDO.
Ни один регион в Украине больше не принял переселенцев.
No other region in Ukraine accepted IDPs.
У нас создан специальный центр 112.
We've created a special center, 112
Любой
center.
человек, которому необходима помощь, может обратиться, и дальше уже работает система в хорошем смысле слова.
Every person who needs assistance addresses this center, and then the system starts working, the system in the good sense of this word.
Представители социальных служб, миграционных, медики и все другие сведены в единый центр, которые работают с переселенцами.
Migration service, social services, healthcare services, they are located in one place which provides assistance to the IDPs.
Если для какой-то области Украины возможно, чтобы эта система не была оптимальна, то в Харьковской области неоптимальная ее работа приведет к серьезным последствиям.
And if in some region the poor working of this system is possible, in Kharkiv this would lead to very bad consequences.
Я могу сказать, что по нашим исследованиям 30% переселенцев собираются остаться в Харькове и не планируют возвращаться.
Well, according to our data, 30% of refugees want to stay in Kharkiv and they do not want to go back.
Эту цифру можно по-разному рассматривать, но я скажу коротко, что треть населения остаются в Харькове и практически готовы выстраивать дальнейшую свою жизнь в Харькове.
So these numbers can be considered in different way, but 1/3 of the population wants to stay in Kharkiv region and they do not want to move anywhere.
Важная задача, которая стояла исключительно перед Харьковской областью, это не допустить гуманитарного кризиса в самой Харьковской области.
An important task for the regional authorities was to prevent the humanitarian crisis in Kharkiv region itself.
Потому что до декабря 2015 года треть области была в зоне АТО также.
Because until the December of 2015, part of Kharkiv region was also within the ADO area.
Нам удалось удержать ситуацию на продовольственном рынке, на потребительском рынке в целом.
We managed to stabilize the situation in the consumer and food supply market on the whole.
Excuse me, Governor, I'm going to stop you there if I may, and we'll jump into the discussion, and hopefully we can come back to your prepared points a bit later. Hryhorij Nemira, I'd like to start with you. As you mentioned, you are from Eastern Ukraine. You are from Donetsk. Describe to us, sitting here in Washington, concretely, the actual situation on the ground, and what are the greatest challenges facing the Ukrainians in the occupied territories? Further, are you getting the response that you need from the West? I'd like to seg into this portion. Is that aid reaching the people on the ground?
Thank you, and I was so much impressed by the presentation of Kharkiv governor that was about to suggest that the capital of Ukraine should move to Kharkiv, because this is the most stable and successful region so far, but hopefully we'll still would manage across Ukraine to have such a stable, however tense situation is. But your question about Donbass, how you could feel secure in the area where you don't have an access to justice, when people with guns on the streets are basically the rationale of your behavior, how you could feel secure and have some confidence in your future when you don't know where to have food, because you don't have money for, or medicines, if you are ill. And this is the notion of uncertainty, sense of lack of protection, permanent risk, brings a particular survival habits that's very difficult to describe. One could read a very reputable Ukrainian weekly Дзеркало тижня. In the last issue, it was a publication of the resident of the area, a woman, journalist, who decided to stay with her children. And he documented basically what she observed, how she felt through all this almost 2 years of occupation. It's really, you could end up reading it in tears. How simple things that you don't recognize in the secure environment become vital for your survival in insecure environments. Access to justice. There are two excellent reports recently produced by a very reputable NGO called Center for Civil Liberties about the justice in exile and access to justice, about the courts in this gray zone in the immediate proximity, how overburdened they are in the territory that the Ukrainian government does control. Or you have a simple issues like you have a phenomenon of divided families. By the way, out of those 75% of IDPs who are living in 5 immediate regions in the immediate proximity, almost 59 to be more precise, are pensioners. But the other situation, when the younger people, more mobile, left, but their parents or great-parents stayed where they are because they don't have where to go, and they decided to stay there. So the access to pensions is something which is the single issue which I would like to highlight that's have a severe impact on a mere survival of those people, especially old people, pensions, who are staying in the temporarily occupied territories. And here, whether we are talking about the straitjacket of Minsk, read Article 8 of the Minsk agreements, or we are talking of the constitutional duty of the state to provide the payment of the benefits to the citizens of the country, whether we are more sophisticated and currently monitoring the cases, typology of cases brought by the Ukrainians to the European Court of Human Rights. And overall, there are about 4,000 cases there, some of them about pensions. Because in the practice of the European Court of Human Rights, pensions is your property. And if it's taken from you, so then there are no doubts that the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights will oblige the state to compensate this. If we're talking about property per se, that people lost because of the insecure environment, because it has been confiscated or ruined, state, we believe, shall provide some mechanism for compensation, or at least to give some hope that it's going to be at least partially confiscated when the stable environment will. So I could go on and on, but this is the situation we are dealing with. And there is not very much reporting from the area. There were some unfortunate examples when those journalists, because of their professional duty, both Ukrainian and foreign, went there and they've been registered there because there is no way to go there and to report back to their readers, have been blamed by some in Ukraine as a traitors, as a perpetrators, as a collaborators with terrorists. So then the mere communication, the picture of the difficult life there is something we have to also recognize. But let me move on the needs of what we expect from. If you talk, and Governor Reinin could confirm, if you talk to the people on the level of the regional administration, those who are dealing or local administration, what they are telling us, and we as a Committee of Human Rights made recently a field trip to the area, to Donetsk Oblast. And we also talked to people from Lugansk. They're telling us we don't need any more of this emergency supply, like covering roof, right? Something this is, we have enough this. We need a bit more different stuff now, which about housing, which about precisely this development paradigm, microloans, micro grants for the self-employment, for the small businesses there, entrepreneurs that could self-employ their families and some in the neighborhood. So this is a different needs. And I think what is needed in conjunction of this short-term emergency time horizon and more mid-term development time horizons to have a very well-done assessment, needs assessment, which is not the case. If you ask whether the government of Ukraine so far has this needs assessment, my answer would be negative. And this needs to be done. Then the other issue of the needs in the longer term. We have a number of international financial institutions that are on the ground, and not such who are dealing with the macro level, like the International Monetary Fund or World Bank. We have European Investment Bank, we have European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. We have some even less known entities that are well equipped and have an experience being players in the conflict zone in other locations across the globe that is not utilized so far. Partially because of the lack of the institutional capacity, both in the center, but also in the regional and local level. Partially because there is no prioritization as far as the strategic need is concerned to utilize this potential which exists. Then we have the whole issue dealing with a set of the problems dealing with those international organizations, bilateral assistance provided by some national governments, either from Nordic countries, Central European countries, Western European countries, from here also, from the United States of America and Canada. Those three issues 2 years ago have been defined like access, taxation, and registration. So far, we more or less solved, or at least partially solved, the issues of taxation and registration of this humanitarian assistance. However, there's still things that needs to be done, but there's still a problem of access. How to make sure that this humanitarian assistance reaches out those who are most in need. So there are some private players there, like the Akhmetov Foundation, and some others who are providing this support. And one could have a different opinion with this, but very frequently this is, especially in the context of abrupt cancellation of the payment of pensions, so alternative ways to deliver the social payments. Probably those private players are someone that needs to be also dealt seriously with, and at least to have some support. And let me finish on a bit something about unintended consequences. So, which is also, we have to keep in mind if we would be willing not to be hostages of this inertia to consider the crisis in Ukraine purely and exclusively within the humanitarian crisis paradigm. Just one example. There is a clear linkage between mismanagement of displacement for various reasons inside the country and the potential growing probabilities of not just violation of basic human rights and freedoms, from social to political, but also, and this we also have to be serious about this as an unintended consequences, to provide the pressure for those IDPs who are staying now in Ukraine to start crossing national borders and to become refugees, to fly to the EU or other places. Because when somebody of translation was, IDPs have been translated as refugees. No, IDPs are basically the same refugees, they didn't cross a national border. But when they cross, they become refugees. So, and then if that would be the case, and we know that Syrians also stayed for 3 to 4 years were in their own country before they started to fly, via Mediterranean, not to fly, to swim basically, to the European Union. We currently have a phenomenon of the probably inception phase of the protracted displacement in Ukraine. And what would be then repercussions, negative repercussions, for hopefully visa-free regime that hopefully the European Union will provide to the Ukrainians for the short-term trips already in the year 2016. There's already a safeguard clause that has been developed, and then whom to blame? The European Union, because they're not sensitive of the hardships of Ukraine, or themselves, policymakers, who mismanaged the displacement crisis. So this is just one example of the lack of attention to the depths of the needs that the crisis is taking the longer it consists. And of course, I have my view on the Minsk and the straitjacket of Minsk. I have points, Article 6, 7, and 8, but I will reserve it for the later on.
Thank you. Taras, I'd like to ask you to jump in here. You, as you mentioned, you are from Crimea, from Kerch, where Putin is building his multi-billion-dollar 12-mile bridge connecting the Russian mainland to Crimea. Tell us about the humanitarian crisis in Crimea specifically, focusing on the plight of the Crimean Tatars.
Thank you very much, Alexa. Yes, of course, if we are talking about humanitarian crisis in Crimea, we should mention that first of all, religious groups, mostly Protestants, who are on our territory, 200,000 of them, Muslims, mostly Crimean Tatars, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kiev Patriarchate, they are under the most pressure. Recently, Russian occupied forces just shut down one of two lasting Ukrainian Orthodox churches of Kiev Patriarchate, and there is enormous pressure on a Protestant community, mostly in the field that ministers who are mostly from mainland Ukraine have been deported. And in return, Russians brought their ministers from central Ukrainian regions like Ryazan, Ulyanovsk, and other very nice places. And in terms of what's going on there, well, in the freedom of speech, we absolutely should be aware that none of independent stations have been left, none of independent newspapers, no radio stations, and the only independent radio stations which is now broadcasting on territory of temporarily occupied Crimea is Radio Reali, a project by Radio Liberty, which works in AM mode, but effectively in AM mode they covers only the northern part of Crimea. And still we have enormous pressure on Muslim communities, especially on Crimean Tatars, who are accused as members of Ibu Tahrir organization. It's Islamic organization which is absolutely legal in Ukraine and absolutely illegal on the territory of Russian Federation. And recently there have been several arrests of Ukrainian activists. The last one was arrested yesterday for one simple reason. He just raised the Ukrainian national flag in his home in Razdolnensky region. It's in the northern Crimea. And just to finalize with Kerch Bridge, my grandmother, she was a witness of building the Nazi bridge in the year 2034, which was effectively finished by Stalin in 1944, but stood only for 6 months, just for one reason: it was absolutely unstable. And the Russians are now facing absolutely the similar problems, which at one point just forced Nazis from stopping the building the bridge. Albert Speer, who was the engineer and architect of Adolf Hitler, who actually rejected from building the project. And recently the price of they have just a practice that every year the price of this bridge is always doubled, and nowadays it reaches about $4 billion.
Adrian, I'd like to bring you in here. What international help does Ukraine need to respond to the humanitarian crisis? And is that help adequate in meeting the challenges of the crisis? And which organizations specifically should be helping, and are they being effective?
Well, as far as I know, in 2015, there were a lot of pledges made, about in the level of $350 million. I don't know if that amount is adequate, but these were sort of international community pledges, and only about half of that actually was delivered in that year. I don't know what the performance is in 2016, but even that amount seems, rather paltry for the scale of the challenge. And what we're talking about is addressing a short-term issue, urgent humanitarian need. There's also the deeper question of, as this conflict goes on with no resolution in sight, as people who've been uprooted from other communities, they need additional resources to integrate. Yes, the private sector sometimes of the economy picks up, but we know the Ukrainian economy is relatively flat. It may be growing at 1 or 2%. It's not a mechanism for creating a lot of jobs. So there is this urgent need for humanitarian aid, and also I would say aid that is more structurally designed to stimulate job growth, but that's a far broader picture. But one thing an interesting factor are the people of the Donbass themselves. If you look at polling data, the people of the Donbass are actually the most. They may have have had Soviet orientations in their understanding of history, but they're the most capitalist of all the Ukrainian regions. They believe that equality of opportunity is the way that a state should guarantee basic rights for its people, as opposed to other parts of Ukraine which have a more paternalistic view that the state should provide equality of outcome. So there is a sort of a culture there of a willingness to adapt to the market, to seek out your own place in society. As to what kinds of organizations, well, we have experts who will be speaking. The gentleman from the Right to Protection, which is a project of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. There are, but I would say that the UN structures are, for whatever criticisms people level at the UN for other failings on the issues of humanitarian aid, it is a reputable agency. Many of the European countries have very well developed and established relationships with non-governmental intermediary organizations. These organizations are time-tested. They are on the ground, so there are the mechanisms for dispersal of this kind of assistance. As I understand it, the resources were the resources that were pledged were not up to the needs, but even there, they only met about 50% of the target.
Right. You mentioned the 350 million, and half was delivered. What happened to the other half?
It was,
what are the obstacles?
it was never pledged or received or transferred. So that
was an assessment conducted by the World Bank that Adrian probably referred to, but there is a security environment that does not make it possible to, but also there is a significant part institutional capacity with whom to have a business with, who will be in charge, how to solve this eternal conflict between the central authorities and the lack of a delegation and then a delegated capacity to utilize it on the local and regional level. These problems, as long as they persist, then there is, that will be a bird in the sky. There's potential investments rather than a real opportunity to harness.
With the chair's permission, can I ask Governor Ranyan to speak about how his oblast, his region, cooperates with international institutions and how much international aid is coming through to help IDPs in the Kharkiv region?
Great question. Governor?
With international organization, we visited Atlantic Council this March.
Обсуждали вопросы Украины, в том числе непосредственно Харьковской области.
We discussed the issues and problems which Ukraine and Kharkiv region are facing
На фоне конфликта на Донбассе.
on the background of this conflict in Donbass.
У нас подписан отдельный меморандум через посольство США в Украине. Правительство Харьковской области, это действительно так.
With the help of the U.S. Embassy, we signed a memorandum between Kharkiv region and U.S. government. So we have this document.
Также в Харьковской области с посольством США подписан отдельный совместный план действий по борьбе с коррупцией.
And Kharkiv region has a signed agreement with the U.S. embassies, like a strategic plan of fighting corruption.
Это как итог визита харьковской делегации в Соединенные Штаты в марте этого года.
This was the result of Kharkiv region delegation visit to the United States in March 2016.
В течение месяца в Харькове откроется консультативная миссия Европейского Союза по вопросам безопасности.
During 1 month, the consultative mission of the European Union on security issues will be opened in Kharkiv.
У нас есть все договоренности, это как принятое решение уже сегодня мы отрабатываем с нашими коллегами из консультативной миссии организационные вопросы.
The agreement has already been achieved, and currently we are working out the specific issues with our European partners.
Очень важно, что эта консультативная миссия именно в Украине откроется именно в Харькове.
It's very important that this consultative mission will be opened exactly in Kharkiv.
Я могу сказать, что за это событие мы конкурировали с другими регионами Украины.
We were competing with other Ukrainian regions as for that.
И считаю это правильным решением, поскольку Харьков ближе всего к зоне АТО.
And I really think that this is a very correct decision to open it in Kharkiv because we are the closest region to the ATO
В
area.
рамках работы консультативной миссии Европейского Союза именно вопросы безопасности и реформирования силовых и правоохранительных органов.
Within this consultative mission, the security issues and the issues of reforming the law enforcement bodies will be the priorities.
И я могу сказать, что в прошлом году 200 международных официальных делегаций посетила Харьковскую область.
I can tell you that last year, 200 official international delegations visited Kharkiv region.
И как результат совместных наших действий с международными организациями, сегодня по темпам роста инвестиций они есть. Харьковская область лидер в Украине, как ни странно.
And as a result of these joint efforts of Kharkiv region and international community, we are leading in terms of investment rate growth.
Я могу сказать, за первый квартал этого года мы имеем рост иностранных инвестиций плюс $130 миллионов. Хотя нам все утверждали, что невозможно, чтобы иностранный бизнес приходил на фронтовую территорию.
According to the data of the first 3 months of the year, we have an increase in international investment by 130 million US dollars, though everybody claimed that it's absolutely impossible to attract foreign investment in the region located next to the anti-terrorist operation area.
До военного конфликта на Донбассе практически большая часть харьковской экономики была завязана на Россию.
Before the military conflict in Donbass, most of Kharkiv region economy was connected with Russian Federation.
Поэтому у нас не оставалось никакого выбора, как быть очень, в хорошем смысле, агрессивными на международном рынке.
So we had no other way out as to be like positively aggressive on the international market.
Но таким образом мы выстраиваем отношения с международным партнером.
So this is how we are building our relationships with foreign partners.
Thank you, Governor. Can I ask one more question before we open it up to questions from the floor? Recently, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe publishes an annual human rights report, and they just released their latest report in the last several days, and reportedly it does not include anything about the occupied territories in Ukraine, and this information is coming straight from the delegation, the Ukrainian delegation on the ground. Grigori, are you getting the response you need from the West? And we haven't talked about the information war. Is that playing a role in the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and in Europe?
With this particular report you mentioned, I think this is outrageous that this chapter on the violations of human rights has not been included, and it became public just this week at the opening of the current plenary session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. 3 weeks ago, I visited Strasbourg and met with the Commissioner of the Council of Europe on Human Rights, who complained also that he has been prevented to do his job there. He visited Crimea in 2014 and then published a bit. But for your information, the only international organizations who have presence, however limited so far, in Donbass now, there are two. One is a special monitoring mission, human rights monitoring mission of the United Nations. They have their representatives in the territory that the government does not control. And the other is International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. And probably with that, it's a problem. But so far, it's quite difficult, even for the body which is currently involved within the Minsk process, for the OSCE to reach out the area and the people for various reasons. But this is in itself very indicative. So the way how closed this is, so the only entity that does not need visa, so to speak, to go there is the Russian humanitarian convoys who are crossing without any in violation, by the way, of the same Minsk agreement that calls for an international mechanism and in agreement with the Ukrainian national government and according with the international procedures. So this is, and the answers overall West, I think and I would like to be a very, so to speak, politically correct here. So if we are left within the straitjacket of Minsk, and will continue the mantra, there is no alternative. We're limiting what can be done and should be done. In addition, not necessarily instead of Minsk. So therefore, whether they are dealing with the issue of these IDPs or the issue of the humanitarian part of Minsk, which again, Article 6, 7, and 8. For me, as a chairman of the Human Rights Committee, this is the first and foremost indicator of the viability of Minsk. If so far, not a single part of this humanitarian component of Minsk has been delivered, starting with exchange all for all hostages. How we could expect that a much more difficult, security-loaded, hard security stuff could be delivered. So therefore, I think we need to move a bit further. The second thing, while we have, of course, sometime we could reason to complain that we're not heard, there is no timely assistance, there are more funds spent to rather Western advisors coming en masse. And probably that was a spin-off to Kharkiv from the national capital, from the central government for these advisors going to there, but not providing what is really needed. But at the same time, I think Ukraine needs to come first to help itself. And this is where I think we should discuss it in a bit different environment, to ask the question, what needs to be done to make this Western help, even if it comes, and we know how limited it could be for various reasons. Refugee crisis is one of this in the EU. Other global challenges. It should be done, it starts with Ukraine. It should start, government mentioned corruption, it's a different topic, but adjacent to the issue. To what extent even just humanitarian help which is coming, guaranteed that it will not be abused because of the entrenched corrupt schemes on the grounds. So, but again, the message, the healthy message for Ukrainians themselves, West is ready to help. Tell us what you need most, and for that, be responsible for your citizens, and then be prepared to utilize this help when and if it will come. There is goodwill that exists. But foremost, this is your country. You have to take responsibility for this and continue to show at least incremental success stories that we could believe and confidence that the help which is coming is utilized in a successful, efficient, and least corrupt way.
Thank you very much, Hrihori. We'd like to open it up to a few questions from the audience before we conclude. Sir, in the second row.
Bogdan Kantor, Library of Congress. I have a human rights question for Dr. Hrihori. You mentioned the human rights and needs of pensioners. There's also, you mentioned 13% of the IDPs are children. Could you address the needs of the children IDPs and the human rights issues?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I would add to the statistics that's about 24% IDPs are working age, so they need jobs also, and there is something that needs to be addressed. But in terms of the closing the legal, the policy, and the operational gaps as far as the IDP is concerned, the legal gap almost has been closed with the advanced law on the freedoms and rights of the internally displaced person, which is effective as of January, 13th of January of this year. So it's a framework law that closed the gap as far as the legal framework for providing and guaranteeing and protecting the rights of the IDPs. Of course, it's not perfect as such, but needs some adjustment to the very fluid situation on the ground, but it does exist. It didn't exist before, now it's in advanced form adopted. The second is a policy gap as far as the governmental institutions responsible to implement and then to use this legal instrument to do their job. Here we have a problem. I could just give you two examples. According to the law, the government has been obliged in the course of 3 months to adjust, to correct, or replace the previous bylaws or resolutions of the government to correspond to this new law, including, for example, some impediments that severely damage mobility for the people. They need to register every 6 months with the state migration service to put a stamp on the ID certificate of the IDPs every 6 months. So it took 5 or 6 months to remedy this with the relevant governmental resolution to be adopted. But at the same time, as far as the pensions are concerned, that the new governmental resolution already of the new government didn't solve it, created a new problem, because it's empowered the law enforcement agencies, national police, state migration service, security service, in addition to the local departments of the Ministry of Social Policy, to do regular, once per 6 months, but also irregular checks of the living conditions, place of residence of the IDPs and their families, including those who are pensioners and entitled for the pensions. So of course, this is indirect discrimination of the IDPs, and it should be removed as such. Political rights, and political rights is a broader notion than just right to vote. But even if we even narrow political rights to the right to vote, 3 elections in a row, presidential, parliamentary, and especially local elections, either for security reasons or because of the impediments that the relevant laws, especially on the local elections, provided, many IDPs, and there are 80% of all those IDPs who are entitled to vote. They have voting rights. So they were not able to exercise their voting rights. So what we have a beginning of the disenfranchisement, that the citizen does not feel citizens of the country, and even in the local communities where they lost a chance to elect the relevant local authorities, how these local authorities that have been elected without a voice of the IDPs, there is no kind of responsibility that is felt to address their issues. So the voice of IDPs is something that needs to be addressed, including starting with the political rights, but also guaranteeing and delivering on the social rights, and the pensioners here are the most outstanding issue. And then we have operational gap. The operational gap, or institutional gap, if you would like, has to do that until recently, and this is a good news with the change that came, we have now a dedicated ministry, governmental ministry devoted to the IDPs. So now you, in theory, know with whom to talk to about, and the core executive, the top executive, about the whole problematics. But this ministry has been established on paper. At the same time, 2 months ago, in mid-April, May, June, as the new government have been formed. So far, there are only 4 employees there, including the minister. There is no funds allocated in the budget, because budget has not been amended. And they are dispersed now in 3 different locations in the capital city of Kyiv, and there is no a separate building that you could come to. How this unfunded ministry with such few people, how they could deliver on the policy that does not exist because there is no strategy to start with. So then we have a dilemma, and this is really, we have to be conscious. I'm telling to you this, which I'm telling back in Kyiv, as far as the parliamentary oversight. Either this ministry, the new ministry, which is good news, will become a real agent for change that will close these various gaps and be recognized as such by the people, or it will doom to become a fig leaf on the attempts, theoretical attempts to address the issue, but in a very window dressing style. So this is an institutional need that needs to be addressed. Then it's also a question to the Western donors. When they're coming, they're talking, and then the question they have, what is your mandate? The problem is that this ministry does not have a mandate yet, approved and agreed with the other line ministries as a cabinet of ministers. So then what is your area of responsibility? We are Ministry of Temporarily Occupied Territories and the IDPs. There is good, well-intended minister, Mr. Chernish, a very nice person, open. We could reach him out easily. But what the value of this be good and accessible, then your ministry does not have the powers to implement the policies. So therefore, I am flagging out this to be conscious that, and probably this ministry needs some institutional support, but only within the under condition that it has real powers, and it's not become a victim of this institutional rivalry in the core executive, which unfortunately we more and more see it as an emerging pattern.
Thank you.
I'm Ginta Polobenskas, an associate professor of political science in West Virginia State University. And I'd like to ask you a very practical question that is of interest to my students. In addition to contacting their elected representatives in support of Ukraine, they want to know, what can the average American do to assist Ukraine in the current situation, if anything?
Let me thank you, and I would not mention that. That's an excellent question. That shows the goodwill of the ordinary people that exist. By the way, the good news that Andrian also mentioned, but he referred to the most recent poll done by the UNHCR and conducted, implemented by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, which is available now. So when asked, do you agree with the statement that IDPs are the same citizens as you are, and their rights needs to be protected and they needs to be helped? 89% across Ukraine said agree, and more than 93, if I'm not mistaken, or 94 said yes, agree with the place where those IDPs are concentrated. It shows a huge positive potential Ukraine as a tolerant society, as that and not have animosity or idiosyncrasies to the people just because they came from the other area in the most difficult economic situation. So it shows a resilience potential of Ukraine, and it's something that could undermine probably Mr. Putin calculations that through the IDPs including, he could undermine the unity of Ukraine. But one of the issues that people could help, when Governor Ryanin was speaking, I was expecting him to say something, look, in the US, we have our twin city, which has happened to be Cincinnati. And we reached out those citizens of Cincinnati so that to help Kharkiv. I don't know whether the case or not. Donetsk, by the way, has a twin city in the United States also, which happened to be Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the former Rust Belt. And Donetsk is probably currently already a former Rust Belt already because it has to transform itself in something new. Probably the experience of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania could be useful for the Donbas people. Probably experience of Cincinnati could be useful for Kharkiv. I don't know which cities also has, but there are many. Chancellor Merkel, when we talked to her some time ago, she said that I instructed my diplomats and others who are relevant also to activate, to re-energize this alliance, which probably, of course, Soviet legacy, because this is twin cities arrangements have been established a long time ago. But in the new circumstances, one could think of breathing a new life and using this twin city context to somehow make those citizens in Ukraine who are in need. And then, of course, the government, the issues of taxation, registration of the humanitarian needs to be part of the coherent policy and monitored. And then, of course, an access that, if provided, this help is distributed and reaching out those who are really needed and not used for commercial purposes.
Alexa, thank you. If I may add very briefly, well, the one thing what we really need is not the money, it's not armament, it's very simple. This year, the United States are going to have a new president. But the problem is, so far, we didn't hear any voice, neither from campaign manager of Hillary Clinton, neither from Donald Trump, what their policies towards Ukraine is going to be, as if they are going to become next US president. We still have time, you know, until they're elected, we still have time to approach their international advisors and to get their point of view, what exactly they're going to do about Ukrainian crisis, what exactly they're going to do with Russian threat. And I think the only chance we can get from you students, from people like you, is to force both candidates to give very clear answer to this very simple question.
Super. Thank you.
Just one, the most trusted bodies to deal with. This is the result of the recent poll of the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, when people, Ukrainians, were asked to whom you trust most. And then there is a hierarchy. The most people trust into the church, followed by the armed forces. And then the third, those NGOs dealing as volunteers to help internally displaced persons. It's a new phenomenon. So they single out those particular segment of the NGOs. This is a new generation of NGOs that didn't exist before. And people are trusting. They consider them not corrupt. So in this is advice, if we could have those Americans that are willing to help, do it through those reputable NGOs, that's many in Ukraine. Some of them you mentioned, Right to Protection, Center for Civil Liberties, Donbass SOS, a very SOS, a very reputable NGO who publishes a weekly monitoring of the situation of the human rights of the internally displaced persons. Vostok SOS, Crimea SOS too, Euromaidan SOS. So those people who are knowing the grounds, they're visiting there regularly, they have a presence. So this is the best way to reach out those people through these reputable NGOs.
Thank you. We have time for one final question. Sir.
Thank you. I'd like to return quickly to the issue of the economic condition of the IDPs and the people who are staying in the East. This afternoon, we will have a perspective of the largest private company in eastern Ukraine and how they've attempted to take on socioeconomic services for their workers as well as some humanitarian aid. But my question is, going forward, starting July 1st with the increase in utility tariffs nationwide, has the economics of the IMF mandated tariff increases been taken into account so there won't be huge adverse shocks for either Crimea or Donbass? Thank you.
This is a neuralgic point you just touched. This is, brings us back to some domestic policy debates, and I used to be on the side of those who some people here in Washington, D.C. call populists for some reason, because if we take this particular part of the policies, which are presented as a part of the austerity measures imposed by the International Monetary Fund, then as someone who dealt with such big beasts like IMF in the past, I think it's always a dialogue, and it should be not as a blanket policy prescriptions given without recognition of such specific situation that you just outlined. Overall, if you take the issue of the living standards, the inflations and the devaluation of the national hryvnia, the purchasing power of people just collapsed. And within such context to impose, and even with the schedule, which is ahead of the schedule, which is now the case, ahead of the schedule that IMF has requested, these tariffs, it would be unbearable. So people would not be able to pay. The policy solution here was to provide subsidies for the poorest. But the people are so poor that those subsidies are now, the people, almost all population will be soon entitled for such subsidies. And if you take the IDPs of particular vulnerable category, they have this monthly payment of a bit more than 400, which again depend very much on whether you will be recognized. You have this ID, which is prolonged or not prolonged, when you have a particular situation. And now they are going to be also inspected, including their living standards, by these mobile groups composed of the law enforcement agencies, whether they, and the protocol of such inspection should be signed by all adults of the family. So if somebody, a teenager of 18 years old, is not present because he is in the summer camp and his signature is not there, in theory that provides an opportunity not to provide this monthly payment. So the question, how for the God's sake these people, I'm not saying this, would be able to pay these communal bills, even if they have already purchased or somehow access to the permanent housing. So I think this is a particular matter that needs to be addressed and communicated to those in a timely manner, because the result would be opposite to what it was supposed to reach. And then, of course, we are all learned the miracles of the so-called Balcerowicz shock therapy in Poland of the 90s. But the same miracles also should be addressed with the situation when Poland in the middle 90s was not famous of being the oligarchic economy, which Ukraine still is. And then the question to what extent these subsidies is a policy options taken in a neutral environment or within a particular environment of the heavily oligarchized, monopolized economy without relevant competition authorities and without an access and relevant labor mobility for the people, then we believe, I believe, that's, and party I belong to, believe that would be a result would be opposite, and then would increase the social tension, would increase tensions in the host communities, because people will complain we don't have jobs as such, and you are competing with us for the jobs we need, and we need jobs because we don't have money to pay for this skyrocketing subsidies. So this is something that needs to be addressed in a very detailed way. And it's not just subsidies, many other issues. And the alternative policies of the, if you take rural area, when they're not basically self-sustainable. They have harvest, they're not basically have money, almost natural. So, but then if you go there and you have a potential of 80% of the agricultural products of Ukraine, in Ukraine, most of them produced by the small farms, family basically farms. And there also somebody, if these policies, prescriptions are taken as a blanket option, will be some to suffer first. And that would be how it could deal with the issue of the social cohesion, which I just said Ukraine has a great potential to demonstrate. But if the pressure will mount in the unbearable way, then again, we, instead of having a success story, unfortunately may have a failure.
Again, over 1.8 million IDPs, over 3.1 million total in need of humanitarian assistance nationwide, almost 10,000 total killed in the war in Donbass. Actually, the number of Ukrainian servicemen killed in the war in Donbass equals the number of American troops killed during roughly 14 years of combat operations in Afghanistan. Some strong views coming out of this panel. Among them, the crisis should be viewed as a development paradigm and opportunity as opposed to simply a short-term response. While international aid is very important, Ukraine at the same time needs to focus on strengthening its internal responses and institutions and creating a concrete response strategy. And it has broad popular support to do so among the wider Ukrainian population, with only 2% having a negative view of this IDP population and its integration, which segues nicely into this afternoon session where we will focus on a collective strategic response. So thank you very much to our distinguished panel for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.